For 11 years, a duchess set 2 plates for dinner, one for herself, and one for a husband the church had already buried. The servants called it grief that refused to end. Her own mother called it madness. But the duchess only smiled, folded her hands, and waited, because she had watched them lower an empty coffin into the ground, and no one, not the priest, not the physician, not even the duke's own brother, had been able to look her in the eye when they did it. The sea had taken the Duke of Ashcombe, or so they said. His ship, the Meridian *, had gone down in a storm off the northern coast, 3 days' sail from home. No survivors. No bodies recovered but for one pulled from the rocks a week later, so ruined by the water and the stones that it could be known only by the signet ring still clinging to what remained of its hand. That ring was enough for the coroner. It was enough for the church. It was enough, apparently, for everyone but the woman who had worn his mother's pearls at her wedding 4 years before. She stood at the front of the chapel in black bombazine, her veil so heavy she could see nothing but the shape of the coffin through it, and she did not cry. She could not explain, even to herself, why she did not cry. She only knew that when the vicar spoke of ashes and dust, something in her, quiet, stubborn, unreasoning, refused to agree. "You must eat something," her mother-in-law whispered beside her, gripping her wrist as if grief were a thing that could be steadied by force. "You must be seen to grieve properly, child." She said nothing. She watched 6 men lower the coffin into the frozen ground of the Ashcombe family plot, and she noted, with the strange clarity that sometimes comes in the worst hours of a life, that the coffin did not sit right in its bearer's hands. It rode too high. It swung too easily. An empty box weighs nothing at all. She told no one what she noticed. Who would have believed her? The physician had signed his name. The ring did not lie, they said, even if the body could not be trusted to. That evening, she returned to Ashcombe Hall, her home, though it did not feel like one anymore, not with the Duke's brother, Lord Reginald, already installed in the study with the estate ledgers spread before him like a man taking inventory of a house, not yet vacated by its dead. She went instead to the small dining room where she and her husband had taken their meals together, just the two of them, away from the grandness of the state rooms he had always found tiresome. She sat at her usual place. Then, before the footman could stop her, she reached across the table and set a second plate. "Your Grace," the footman said carefully, "shall I?" "Leave it," she said. "Bring the soup for 2. He did not argue, but she saw the look that passed between him and the housekeeper in the doorway, the look reserved for the unwell, the unraveling, the ones to be watched. She did not care. She ate her soup in silence, across from an empty chair and a full plate slowly going cold, and when she was finished, she folded her napkin exactly as she always had, exactly as if he might yet walk through the door, stamping the rain from his boots and complaining about the crossing. Upstairs, Lord Reginald was already speaking to the family solicitor in low, unhurried tones about matters of succession. She only knew, with a certainty she could not have defended before any court or clergyman, that somewhere beyond the reach of the sea, her husband was still alive, and that whoever had made certain the world believed otherwise had made one very small, very human mistake. They had never found his ring finger attached to a hand she recognized. They had simply found a ring. Grief, she learned quickly, was a season allowed to widows only so long as it did not inconvenience anyone. By the second week, Lord Reginald had moved his belongings into the master apartments, not her husband's private rooms, not yet, but close enough that the servants had begun addressing him, quietly, as His Grace. She corrected no one. She was not certain in her heart that the title belonged to him at all, and she would not dignify a theft by pretending it was an inheritance. "You understand this is simply practical," Reginald told her one morning, over a breakfast she had not invited him to share. He had her husband's coloring, the same dark hair, but none of the warmth that had lived behind her husband's eyes. In its place was something colder, a patience that felt less like grief and more like arithmetic. The estate cannot run itself while we wait for courts to untangle a dead man's affairs. Someone must hold the reins. The reins, she said, were left to me. My husband's will was quite clear. Your husband's will, Reginald said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse, presumed he would die an old man in his bed, surrounded by sons. He did not anticipate dying childless at sea, with only a wife too young to manage a household this size, let alone an estate of 11,000 acres. He set down his cup. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because someone must. She held his gaze longer than was polite. You seem to have given this a great deal of thought, for a man only 2 weeks in mourning. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. I have given it the thought it requires. By the end of that month, she found herself asking the housekeeper's permission to order coal for her own sitting room. By the end of the second month, the family solicitor, a man who had served her husband loyally for a decade, began addressing his letters to Lord Reginald, acting steward of the Ashcombe estate asterisk, and she understood, with a slow and terrible clarity, that grief was not the only thing being managed in that house. She was being managed too. There were whispers, of course. She heard, in fragments not meant for her ears, that Reginald had written to London before the funeral had even been arranged, that he had known, somehow, precisely which solicitors to consult and precisely how quickly a widow's authority could be quietly dismantled if no one contested it. She began, in the privacy of her own rooms, to make a list, not of grievances, she had no shortage of those, but of facts, small, hard, verifiable facts, the date the ship had sailed, the date Reginald had first written to London, the name of the physician who had examined a body too ruined to be examined at all and signed his name to it regardless. She did not yet know what she meant to build with these facts. She knew only that a woman thought too foolish, too grief-mad to be listened to, was in an excellent position to listen to everyone else. That evening she set 2 plates again. The housekeeper, passing the doorway, paused this time long enough to say, gently, Your Grace, it might ease things with Lord Reginald with the staff if you were to let the second setting go. The Duchess did not look up from her soup. When my husband returns, she said, I intend for his dinner to be waiting. The housekeeper did not answer, but she did not clear the second plate either, and long after the woman had gone, the Duchess sat alone with the sound of rain against the windows, and the strange, stubborn certainty that somewhere out past that rain, a debt was quietly coming due. It was Reginald's own efficiency that handed her the first real thread to pull. Barely 3 months into his self-appointed stewardship, he had already ordered her husband's effects catalogued and dispersed, coats given to the poor of the parish, correspondence boxed for the solicitor, personal items crated for the attics, all of it managed with the brisk tidiness of a man clearing out a rented room rather than sorting through the remains of his own brother's life. He informed her of this arrangement rather than asked her opinion of it, over breakfast, between the marmalade and the Morning Post. The Reverend Hollies has need of good coats before winter, he said, not looking up from his correspondence. It seemed a fitting use for them. Charity does the family credit. Those were his, she said quietly. Yes, Reginald agreed, in the tone of a man agreeing that water was wet. And now they will keep some poor tenants back warm through January, rather than molder in a trunk no one opens. I should think he would have approved. She asked instead, in the mildest voice she could manage, whether she might be permitted to go through the coats herself before they left the house, a widow's last small errand. Reginald studied her for a moment too long, then waved a hand. As you wish. See it done by Friday. She began that same afternoon. The attic where the crates waited was cold and close under the eaves. She went through the coats one by one. The blue superfine he'd worn to their wedding breakfast, the shooting jacket with the frayed cuff, and finally the greatcoat, still faintly salt-stiffened, that he had worn the morning he rowed for the harbor. She held that one longest. She remembered its exact weight across her shoulders once, on a cold walk along the cliffs, when he draped it over her without asking and pretended not to notice the cold himself for the rest of the afternoon. She remembered the collar, which never sat quite right, which he complained of every time he wore it, and which she had promised more than once to have altered, and never had. She was folding it slowly, the way one folds something meant to be kept rather than packed away, when her fingers caught on an unevenness along the inner seam. Not a tear. A seam that had been opened deliberately and re-stitched, the thread mismatched, the stitches wide and uneven in a way that spoke of a hand unused to needlework, working quickly, working in poor light, working in secret. Her husband had never sewn a stitch in his life. She sat down on an overturned trunk, the coat in her lap, and with fingers no longer quite steady, worked the poor stitches loose. Inside was a single sheet of paper, soft at its creases from having been folded and unfolded more than once before it was hidden there for good. No salutation, no signature, only a handful of lines in her husband's unmistakable hand, hurried, blotted in places, as though written at speed, perhaps on a moving ship, perhaps by candlelight with one ear turned toward the door. If this reaches no one, it does not matter, and I have wasted an evening's ink on my own foolishness. If it reaches you, know that I did not trust the manifest for this crossing, nor the men who drew it up, nor the haste with which R insisted the Meridian sail before her repairs to the hull were properly finished. The shipwright himself told me as much, quietly, the night before we sailed, and was gone from the yard by morning paid off, I think, though I could not prove it before we left port. I have said nothing of this aloud. I do not wish to accuse where I cannot yet prove, and I have been wrong about worse men than my own brother before. I mean only to watch, and to be careful, and to keep this where no hurried hand will think to look for it. If I am wrong, no harm is done by caution. If I am right, do not let them tell you I was careless with the ship, or with my life, or with anything that mattered to me. I have never in my life been careless with what matters, you least of all. She read it once and did not understand it. She read it a second time and felt the attic tilt very slightly around her. By the fourth reading, her hands had gone perfectly steady, in the particular, frightening way that hands go steady only when the mind behind them has decided, finally, to stop being afraid and start being useful instead. There was only one *R in her husband's life with the standing to hurry a shipyard, the influence to see a shipwright quietly paid off and gone by morning, and the motive she thought of the master apartments, the ledgers, the solicitor's letters now addressed to Lord Reginald, acting steward to want a ship, and the man aboard it to never reach harbor again. Her husband had not simply died in a storm. He had suspected, before he ever set foot on that ship, that something was being arranged against him, and rather than accuse a brother he could not yet prove guilty, he had hidden the proof of his suspicion in the one place he trusted no one would think to search. Sewn against his own heart, in the coat that would ride home on his back, guilty or not, alive or not. She did not weep. Grief, strange and useless as it was, seemed to have finally stepped aside in her to make room for something with sharper edges. When at last she rose, she folded the letter along its original creases with great care, and slipped it into the hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her own morning gown. She carried the coat back downstairs herself. "Send the rest to the Reverend on Friday, as instructed," she told the housekeeper, her voice admirably even. "This one I'll keep. A widow is entitled to one indulgence, I think." The housekeeper, who had watched this particular widow set 2 plates for dinner every evening for 11 weeks without comment, did not so much as blink. "Of course, Your Grace." That night, when she set the second plate at the small dining table, it was no longer a habit she could not explain even to herself. It was a promise. And for the first time since the church bells had tolled for a man she was now nearly certain was not in that coffin at all, she found she was not merely waiting. She was preparing. Knowledge, she discovered, was a strange kind of weight. It did not lighten her step, as she had imagined proof of her husband's murder in the making might. It settled instead into her spine like cold water, so that she moved through the house differently, more slowly, more watchfully, a woman walking across ice she alone knew to be thin. She told no one of the letter, not the housekeeper, who had been kind to her in small, careful ways since the funeral, not her own mother, whose letters had grown steadily more impatient with her daughter's refusal to come to her senses. Certainly not Reginald, who watched her now with the particular attention of a man checking whether a trap he had laid was still sprung, or whether something inside it had begun, quietly, to move. She needed more than the letter. She needed the shipwright. She needed the name of whoever had paid him. And above all, she needed to appear exactly as mad and as harmless as everyone already believed her to be, because a woman thought to be losing her mind was a woman no one thought to watch closely. It was not difficult to play the part. In truth, she barely had to act at all. Reginald began inviting guests to the house that winter, not for her sake, he made plain, but to restore some normalcy to a household that had mourned quite long enough for propriety's sake. Among them was a Mr. Aldous Price, a widower of considerable land and unremarkable conversation, seated beside her at dinner with a frequency too deliberate to be accidental. "A fine match in time," she overheard Reginald tell his solicitor one evening, through a door not quite closed. "Once the year of mourning is properly observed, of course, we must be seen to do things correctly." Properly observed. As though her grief were a clause in a contract, to be honored only so long as it served him, a full year to quiet the whispers, then a convenient remarriage to remove her and any claim on the estate permanently from his path. That night, when the housekeeper set the second plate down without being asked, the Duchess understood she had gained an ally. It was Mrs. Fenwick, 30 years in service to the family, who first mentioned the shipwright's name. "My sister's boy works the yards at Whitmore," she said one evening, laying out linens with unhurried care. "Says there was talk when the Meridian went down, talk of a man called Duffy, the right who signed off her hull repairs, packing up sudden like the very week she sailed. No notice given, no wages collected, if you can credit that. A man doesn't leave good wages behind him for nothing, Your Grace." Where did this Duffy go, do you suppose? That's the strange part. No one rightly knows, just gone. Mrs. Fenwick met her mistress's eyes. "My sister's boy says it were queer money that sent him off so sudden. Queer and quiet, and more than a shipwright sees in a year of honest work." Queer money, quiet money. The kind a man newly certain of an inheritance might part with gladly to purchase a silence worth far more than any wage. "I don't suppose your nephew would know how a person might write to this Mr. Duffy," the Duchess said softly, assuming she wished to. Mrs. Fenwick did not ask why a grieving Duchess might wish to correspond with a vanished shipwright. She only nodded once, in the manner of a woman who had already decided which side of a silent war she stood on. "I'll ask, Your Grace," discreetly. That single word passed between them like a signed treaty. 3 days later, Reginald cornered her in the long gallery, where she walked each morning, ostensibly for her health, in truth to be alone with her thoughts. "You seem improved," he said, falling into step beside her. "Color in your cheeks again. Mr. Price remarked on it just yesterday." "I am learning to manage my grief, as everyone insists I must." Good. He paused before her husband's portrait, a young man painted before his hair had silvered, laughing at some joke the artist never recorded. Reginald studied it with an expression she could not name, not grief, something closer to appraisal. He was always the fortunate one, he said, almost to himself. Fortune favors the careless, I've found. It rarely lasts. He was not careless, she said before she could stop herself. Reginald turned to her, something sharpening behind his eyes. No. She made herself smile, the vague, pliant smile of a woman still lost somewhere in her own grief, unequal to sharp conversation. No man is careless who loves his home as much as he did, only unlucky. The sea takes good men and bad men with equal indifference, I'm told. Something in his shoulders eased, and she understood exactly how thin the ice beneath her still was, and how carefully she would need to walk. Quite so, Reginald said, offering his arm to escort her to breakfast. She took it, because a woman thought mad and harmless did not refuse such small courtesies, whatever war was quietly being fought beneath them. That night she took out the hidden letter and read it once more by candlelight, not for its contents, which she now knew by heart, but for the shape of his handwriting, proof that somewhere in it lived the man Reginald had just called fortunate and careless, and past tense. Not past tense asterisk, she thought, folding it away. Not yet. She set the second plate that night with rather more purpose than usual, and somewhere beyond the reach of the dining room windows, past the dark hedgerows and the frost-hardened road, a man with a scar along his jaw and a name that was no longer quite his own sat in a rented room above a tavern in a port town 3 counties distant, writing, by poor candlelight, a very careful letter of his own. The stranger arrived at Ashcombe in the last week of March, on foot, in the sort of rain that soaked through wool and patience alike, and asked the head groundskeeper whether the estate had any use for a man who understood horses better than he understood most people. He gave his name as Mr. John Hale. He was taller, the groundskeeper would later remark, than seemed quite natural for a man who carried himself so carefully, as though every movement had been relearned rather than simply remembered. A long scar traced from his left temple down along the jaw, pale and old, the kind of mark that made housemaids glance twice and then look quickly away. He walked with the faintest hitch in his left leg, more pronounced on cold mornings, though he seemed to will it into stillness whenever he thought himself observed. He asked for work in the stables. He asked for nothing more, no advance on wages, no curiosity about the family whose horses he would groom, though he answered every question about his own history with an ease so practiced it was almost, though not quite, convincing. The head groundskeeper put him to work that same afternoon, and within a week had nothing but praise for him. Mr. Hale had a gift with the animals that unsettled the other grooms rather more than it impressed them. Horses that had thrown 3 riders that season stood calm and still for him within minutes, as though some old understanding passed between them that required no words at all. The Duchess did not see him for nearly a fortnight. It was Mrs. Fenwick who first mentioned him, in passing, over the household accounts, in the careful, roundabout way the housekeeper had developed for conveying information she suspected her mistress might find of interest. New grooms settled in well enough, Mrs. Fenwick said, not looking up from the ledger. Quiet sort, keeps to himself. Mr. Danvers says he's never seen a man handle a frightened horse so gentle. A pause precisely timed. Says he's got a scholar's way of speaking for a groom. Odd that. The Duchess said nothing, but she filed the observation away with the same careful attention she gave every small, odd fact these days. She met him properly on an afternoon in early April, when a spring storm caught her 3 fields from the house, and she took shelter, wet and undignified, in the nearest stable door, only to find it already occupied by a tall man kneeling beside an anxious mare, speaking to the animal in a low, unhurried murmur that stopped the moment the door swung open. He rose at once, properly, correctly, a groom's beau, nothing more. And yet something in the economy of the movement struck her with a familiarity so sudden and so unwelcome that she nearly lost her footing on the wet stone threshold. "Your Grace." His voice was low, careful, roughened in a way she could not place. "Forgive me, I hadn't expected company." "Nor I," she said, and found her own voice was not entirely steady. "You're the new man, Hale, is it?" "John Hale, Your Grace." He did not meet her eyes for longer than propriety required, and yet in the brief moment that he did, she felt something in her chest turn over slowly, painfully, like a key finding its lock after a very long search. His eyes were a color she had spent 4 years of marriage memorizing in every light. She told herself, firmly, that grief did this. Grief found ghosts in strangers. "You've a gift with the horses," she said instead, retreating into small talk. "Mrs. Fenwick tells me even Juniper has taken to you, and that mare's thrown better men than most of my husband's grooms." Something crossed his face at the word *husband, swift, complicated, gone before she could read it fully. "Animals are simpler than people, Your Grace," he said. "They don't require you to pretend to be anything other than what you are." "A luxury," she said, "that few of us are permitted." "No," he agreed quietly, "few of us are." The rain continued beyond the stable door, and the Duchess found herself studying his hands, a groom's hands, weathered and calloused, and yet holding themselves with an unconscious precision, thumb and forefinger poised as though accustomed once to a very different kind of instrument. A quill, perhaps. She could not say why the thought frightened her nearly as much as it thrilled her. "You're not from these parts," she said. It was not quite a question. "No, Your Grace." He busied himself with the mare's bridle, not quite looking at her. "I've been many places this past year. None of them, I confess, quite like home." "And where is home, Mr. Hale?" The silence that followed lasted a beat too long to be comfortable. "That," he said finally, with something that might have been the ghost of an old, familiar humor carefully banked down, "is rather a complicated question, Your Grace. I hope you'll forgive me for not answering it properly today." She should have pressed him. She did none of these things. She only nodded as though his answer had satisfied her, and gathered her wet skirts and made her excuses to return to the house before the rain worsened further. But walking back across the sodden fields, her heart beating in a manner entirely disproportionate to a chance conversation with a stable hand, she could not stop turning the shape of him over in her mind. The height of him, the careful economy of his movements, the eyes that had made something in her chest ache with a grief she had thought, by now, well practiced and well contained. It is not him, she told herself firmly, climbing the terrace steps. It cannot be him. Grief makes fools of the sanest women, and you have been a fool for 11 weeks already. Do not become a greater one now, over a groom with sad eyes and a scar he will not explain. And yet that evening, setting the second plate as she had every evening for nearly 3 months, she found her hands trembling very slightly as she smoothed the linen beside it, and told herself, unconvincingly, that it was only the cold. In the stables that night, long after the last lamp in the great house had been extinguished, the man who called himself John Hale sat alone on an overturned feed bucket, a stub of candle burning low beside him, and stared for a long time at a letter he had begun and abandoned 3 times already. Addressed to no one, in a hand he had been carefully, painfully unlearning to disguise for the better part of a year, because a man who wished to remain dead could not afford, even in secret, to write like a duke. Not yet, he thought, watching the candle gutter. Not until I am certain there is no one left to silence her for what she already knows. He blew out the candle and did not sleep. Spring settled properly over Ashcombe through April, and with it came a curious, unspoken arrangement between the Duchess and the man called John Hale. It began with a horse. The mare, Juniper, had been a wedding gift from her husband's own stables, and the Duchess had ridden her nearly every fair morning of her marriage, until grief made even the stable yard unbearable. But something about the quiet competence of the new groom made the yard feel, for the first time in months, like a place she might endure rather than avoid. And so she began to ride again, most mornings, with Hale walking beside the mare, correcting her seat with a diffidence that never quite disguised the authority beneath it. "You ride as though you were taught by a cavalryman," she observed one morning. "I've kept company with a few in my time," he said, not quite answering the question she had actually meant to ask. "And where was that, Mr. Hale? You've still never properly told me where you're from." He glanced up, and for a moment something almost like amusement flickered behind the careful blankness he wore like a second coat. "You are very persistent, Your Grace, for a woman who claims no particular interest in her groom's history." "I claim no such thing," she said, more sharply than she intended, then softer. "I am merely curious. It is not every day Ashcombe hires a groom who speaks Latin under his breath to nervous horses." "A defrocked scholar," he repeated, and this time the amusement did not quite hide itself in time. "I confess I've been called worse." "Then what were you called before Ashcombe?" The question landed heavier than she had intended, and she watched him go still in the particular way she had come to recognize. Not the stillness of a man caught in a lie, exactly, but the stillness of a man weighing how much truth a moment could bear. "A soldier for a time," he said finally, "and before that, a man with rather more than his fair share of good fortune, who did not always deserve it, and who lost most of it in a single season through no particular virtue of his own restraint." He busied himself with the bridle again. "I find I prefer honest work now. It asks less of a man than fortune ever did." She found, riding home that morning, that she believed him, not the specifics, which remained maddeningly vague, but the shape of the sentiment beneath them. Grief and loss had taught her to recognize their own kind in other people. It was on a warmer afternoon in late April, walking Juniper back to the stables, that she found herself, without quite meaning to, telling him about her husband. "He used to complain about this very stable," she found herself saying, running her hand along Juniper's neck. "Said the drainage was poor and the roof leaked over the third stall, and every year he meant to have it repaired, and every year something else took precedence, and I used to tease him that Ashcombe would collapse entirely around him before he attended to anything so unglamorous as a leaking roof." "Did he ever fix it?" Hale asked, and something in his voice had gone very quiet. "No," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that she was smiling rather than grieving as she said it. "He never did. I think of that sometimes, how very like him it was, to love a place so completely and still never quite manage its practical demands. He once rode 11 miles in a storm to bring me a book he thought I'd enjoy, and forgot entirely to send word he'd be late for his own dinner. I was furious with him for a week. I'd give a great deal to be furious with him again." She had not spoken so freely about her husband to anyone since the funeral, but something about the stable groom's careful, patient silence had drawn the words out of her before she quite realized what she was giving away. "He sounds," Hale said very carefully, "like a man who was loved very thoroughly." "He was," she said, "is." She corrected herself, not looking at him. "I have never quite managed to make myself say asterisk was asterisk, if I'm honest with you, Mr. Hale. Everyone thinks it madness, but I cannot make myself believe the sea took him so completely as the coroner insists it did." She glanced up then, expecting the same gentle, pitying indulgence she received from everyone else who heard her speak this way, and found instead that his face had gone entirely still, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "I do not think it foolish, Your Grace," he said, very low. "I think a wife's instinct is not so easily dismissed as the world would have you believe." Something passed between them in that moment, brief, charged, entirely inappropriate to the difference in their stations, and entirely unmistakable to both of them. And the Duchess found herself stepping back rather more quickly than the moment strictly required. "You're very kind to indulge a mad widow's fancies, Mr. Hale," she said, striving for lightness and not quite achieving it. "I don't believe you mad, Your Grace." His voice had gone rough around the edges. "I believe you rather more perceptive than anyone in this house gives you credit for." She did not know how to answer that. She excused herself rather more hastily than politeness required, and did not look back to see the expression on his face as he watched her go, an expression that mingled tenderness and guilt in such equal, painful measure that had she seen it, she might have understood everything a full 4 chapters sooner than fate intended to allow her. That night, setting the second plate as she had for nearly 4 months now, she found herself thinking not only of her husband's face, but of a stable groom's careful stillness, and the particular quiet way he had said, "I do not think it foolish," and felt, for the first time since the funeral, a confusion of heart she did not have adequate language to name. In the stables, John Hale sat long into the night with his head in his hands, and thought, not for the first time, that loving his own wife in disguise, watching her grieve him honestly while he lied to her by omission every single day, might well prove the cruelest penance a guilty conscience had ever devised for itself, and that he did not yet know how much longer he could bear to let her go on doing it. Mrs. Fenwick's nephew wrote back at last in the second week of May, and the Duchess read his letter 3 times over before she trusted herself to understand it properly. The shipwright Duffy, it transpired, had indeed gone to Bristol, though not by his own choosing entirely. He had taken lodgings under an assumed name, a detail that struck the Duchess, reading it by candlelight with her door locked, as being altogether too familiar a habit for comfort. He had been found there by an ague no physician's care could cure, and had died in a rented room above a chandler's shop, with only a landlady and a stray cat for company. But he had left something behind. A single sealed letter, discovered among his effects, passed through the tangled chain of the nephew's acquaintance into Mrs. Fenwick's careful hands, and now into the Duchess's own. She broke the seal with fingers that would not quite stay steady. "I do not know who will read this, if anyone does, and I do not much care any more what becomes of me for the writing of it, seeing as I am like to be dead of this fever before the season turns regardless. But I will not go to my grave with this on my conscience unspoken." The Meridian's hull was not sound when she sailed. I told the young lord as much myself, the night before she left port, and he thanked me for my honesty and said he would look into it himself, quiet-like, and asked me to say nothing further until he had. It was his brother who came to me after, not 2 days before she sailed. Lord R, he called himself. He offered me money, a great deal of money, to sign off the repairs as sound regardless, and to hold my tongue about what I'd told the young lord already. He said his brother was overcautious by nature, and that a delayed sailing would cost the family dear in contracts already promised abroad. I am ashamed to say I took the money. I told myself no real harm would come of it. When word came the Meridian was lost, I did not sleep again for a fortnight. I left Whitmore within the week, on money that felt more like blood than coin the longer I carried it. But I will say this plain for whoever finds this letter. Lord R knew that ship was not fit to sail. He knew it before ever she left port, and he paid good money to see her sail regardless. Whatever the sea did after that was the sea's own business. But the sending of her out unsound, that was his doing, and no accident of weather at all. The Duchess sat for a long while after reading it, the letter loose in her lap, her candle burning low, and found that what she felt was not triumph. It was something colder and heavier, the particular grief of having a suspicion confirmed in every detail, with none of the relief that confirmation was supposed to bring. She now had 2 letters, a dead man's confession and a living man's suspicion, and between them a chain of evidence that might, presented properly to the right magistrate, be enough to see Reginald tried for conspiracy to murder. What she did not have was a way to bring either letter forward, without revealing that she had spent 5 months quietly gathering evidence against the very man managing her household. A man with the resources and the ruthlessness, she now knew beyond doubt, to ensure that any threat to his position met precisely the same fate the Meridian had. It was this fear that drove her to the stables 3 nights later, well past the hour any respectable duchess ought to have been anywhere near them, both letters folded together inside her sleeve, because there was only one person in that household whose steadiness she trusted enough to share the weight with. She found Hale awake, sitting by the low light of a single lamp with a book open and unread upon his knee. "Your Grace," he was on his feet at once, alarm plain on his face, "has something happened? Are you unwell?" "I need to tell someone," she said, her voice cracking. "I have carried this alone for months, and I cannot carry it alone any longer." He drew her inside, propriety abandoned entirely, and listened, truly listened, as she told him everything. The coat, the hidden letter in her husband's own hand, Mrs. Fenwick's nephew, and the shipwright Duffy, and the dying man's confession now folded inside her sleeve alongside the first. She watched something shift in his face as she spoke, not surprise. She realized only afterward, turning the memory over in the sleepless nights that followed. Something closer to recognition, something closer to a man hearing, at last, a story he already knew the ending of. "You believe me," she said when she had finished. "Everyone else would think me mad, but you don't." "No," he said, very low, his voice roughening in a way she had heard only once before. "I do not think you mad, Your Grace. I think you have been entirely, terrifyingly correct about everything, for rather longer than anyone in your life has given you credit for." "Then you believe he's alive," she said. "My husband, you believe it too." And there in the low lamplight, with 2 letters folded against her arm, and her whole careful, patient, 5-month campaign of proof, laid bare before a man she had known only since March, John Hale, who was not John Hale at all, who had watched his own wife grieve him with an honesty that had very nearly broken something essential in his chest every single day since he'd first seen her walk into that stable soaked with rain, opened his mouth to tell her the truth at last. And found, in the very same instant, the sound of hoofbeats on the drive outside, far too late an hour for any honest visitor, and a shout from the direction of the house that turned his blood to ice before he had spoken a single word of the confession he had finally been ready to give her. "Fire," the voice cried, distant but unmistakable. "Fire in the east wing. Fetch water, fetch every hand." The Duchess was on her feet before the shout had finished, her letters clutched to her chest, her face gone white with a fear that had nothing at all to do with the flames, and everything to do with the sudden, terrible certainty that a fire breaking out on the very night she had finally shared her evidence with another living soul was no coincidence whatsoever. "Stay here," Hale said, already moving past her toward the door, his careful groom's diffidence entirely stripped away and replaced by something that moved and commanded like a man born to give orders in far more desperate circumstances than a house fire. "Stay here, and do not, under any circumstances, let anyone see those letters." "I will not stay here while my home burns," she said, already following him out into the night. He turned back once at the stable door and looked at her with an expression she would spend the rest of her life trying to properly describe. Desperate, tender, terrified, and underneath it all, unmistakably, entirely her husband's own particular way of looking at her, when he thought the moment too urgent for softer words. "Then stay close to me," he said, Whatever happens tonight, promise me that much." She did not yet understand why a groom's plea should sound so exactly like a vow she had once spoken before an altar. She only nodded and ran with him toward the burning house, utterly unaware that the very evidence she had risked everything to gather might, before this night was through, be the only thing standing between her husband's carefully guarded secret and a death far more permanent than the one already carved upon his empty gravestone. The east wing was already lost by the time she reached the terrace, flames licking hungrily up through the old library's window frames, the smoke rolling black and thick against a sky still full of unconcerned stars. Servants ran everywhere with buckets that seemed pitifully small against the roar of it, and somewhere in the chaos she could hear Mrs. Fenwick's voice, sharp and commanding, organizing a bucket chain from the kitchen well. The Duchess stood frozen for one terrible moment, watching the fire eat through the room where her husband had kept his books, his maps, the small collection of shells he'd gathered as a boy, watching 4 years of a marriage's small, particular treasures curl to ash before her eyes, and then Hale's hand closed around her wrist and pulled her back, hard, from the heat that had begun to singe the hem of her nightgown. "Not that way," he said, his voice cutting through her shock with an authority that brooked no argument. "The stairs on that side will be gone within minutes." He was already moving toward the side entrance, and she followed, her bare feet bruising against gravel she barely felt, and it was only as they rounded the corner of the house, into the relative dark beyond the fire's glow, that she saw Reginald. He stood a little apart from the chaos, watching the flames consume the east wing with an expression she would spend a long time afterward trying to properly name, not horror, not grief. Something closer to satisfaction, quickly and imperfectly smoothed over the moment he became aware he was observed. "Your Grace." He came toward her with his usual measured calm, though she thought she caught, beneath it, something taut and watchful. "Thank God you're safe. I feared you'd been caught in the east wing when it started." "I was not in the house at all," she said, and heard, too late, how strange that admission sounded, spoken by a duchess found half-dressed near the stables at 2 in the morning. Reginald's eyes moved, slow and deliberate, from her face to the man standing half a step behind her shoulder, and something in his expression sharpened, just perceptibly. "Your groom," he said softly, "how very attentive of him to escort you from the stables at such an hour." His gaze lingered on Hale a moment too long. "Remind me, Hale, was it? How long have you been in service here?" "Since March, my lord," Hale said, and his voice had gone flat and careful in a way the Duchess had not heard from him before. "March," Reginald repeated. "How curious. I don't recall approving your engagement personally. I do like to know the men in my employ, Hale." The word asterisk, my asterisk, landed with a particular, deliberate weight. My employ, my house, my brother's estate already spoken of as settled fact, and the Duchess felt something cold and furious rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire still burning 40 feet away. It was at that precise moment that a groundskeeper came running, breathless, his face streaked black with soot. "My lord, we found the start of it, a lamp, overturned near the library window and the shutter forced from outside. It weren't no accident, my lord." Silence fell across the small, gathered group, broken only by the distant roar of the fire and the frantic clank of buckets. Reginald recovered first, his face arranging itself into alarm a fraction of a second too late to be convincing. "Deliberate. Good God. Some vagrant, I expect. I'll have the magistrate sent for at first light." But the Duchess was no longer looking at Reginald. She was looking at John Hale, whose face had gone very white and very still, his eyes fixed on Reginald with an expression she had never once seen him wear, not the careful blankness of a groom minding his place, but something raw and furious and entirely, unmistakably aristocratic in its cold, contained rage. "A poacher," Hale said slowly, "who happened to set his fire in the one room of the house containing every ledger and correspondence relating to the Ashcombe estate's finances for the past decade. How very convenient a poacher, my lord." Reginald's eyes snapped to him, and for the first time that night, the Duchess saw something crack in her brother-in-law's careful composure. "You forget yourself," Reginald said very quietly. "Do I?" Hale did not step back. If anything, he drew himself up taller, and something in the movement, the set of his shoulders, the lift of his chin, a bearing no amount of stable work could have taught a genuine groom in a mere 2 months, made the Duchess's breath catch painfully in her throat. The pieces of a puzzle she had been almost too afraid to assemble finally, terribly, clicking into place before her eyes. "Who are you," Reginald said very slowly, "to speak to me in such a manner?" Hale reached up then, with a hand that was not quite steady, and pushed back the loose hair he had worn deliberately long and disheveled since March hair that had, she now realized with a jolt that went through her whole body like cold water, been carefully arranged to obscure exactly what it obscured now, as he swept it back from his temple to reveal, beneath it, a small and very particular birthmark just above his left ear, shaped faintly like a crescent moon, that she had traced with her own fingers on 100 quiet mornings of her marriage. The Duchess made a sound she did not recognize as her own voice, something between a sob and a gasp. "You," Reginald breathed, and all the color drained from his face at once. "It cannot be. You are *dead. I saw to it myself, He stopped, too late. The words already spoken, already hanging in the smoke-thick air between them, an admission no amount of frantic backtracking could ever fully retract. "Yes," said the man who was not John Hale at all, his voice no longer flat and careful but resonant with a fury. 4 years of marriage, and one very long deception, had never once allowed the Duchess to hear from him before. "I rather think you did, brother, though you'll forgive me for having disappointed you in the particulars." The Duchess stood utterly still amid the chaos of the dying fire, and felt the entire structure of her grief. Every solitary dinner, every second plate set with trembling hands, every night spent convincing herself she was not simply a madwoman, collapse all at once into something that was not quite relief and not quite fury, and not quite the purest joy she had ever known, but some overwhelming, wordless combination of all three together. "You're alive," she said, her voice breaking entirely on the second word. "You're alive all this time, all these months watching me, letting me believe." He turned to her then, and every ounce of the cold fury he had aimed at his brother dissolved instantly into something so raw and so pleading that she felt her own anger falter despite everything. "I could not risk it," he said, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to cradle her face with a desperate gentleness that felt, after everything, achingly, impossibly familiar. "The men who tried to kill me, Reginald's men, though I did not have proof enough of that until Duffy's letter reached you, they believed they had succeeded. The moment I revealed myself alive, they would have come again, and this time they would not have failed so carelessly. I could not protect you and reveal myself both. I chose the only protection I could offer you in secret. God forgive me, I know now it was not enough. I have watched every single night what it cost you, setting that second plate, and I could not." "You let me grieve you," she said, and could not tell in that moment whether she meant it as accusation or absolution, or some impossible combination of both at once. "For 11 weeks I grieved you at that funeral, and for 5 months more I have grieved you every single evening at that table, and you watched me do it." "Every night," he said, his composure finally, entirely abandoning him. "Every single night I watched that second plate from the window of the servants' passage, and I have never in my life hated myself more thoroughly than I hated myself in those moments. I was building the case, my love. Every week I did not speak. I was building the very proof that would let me come home to you safely, rather than come home to bury you beside an empty grave that had, by then, become entirely too real a possibility for my comfort. Behind them, Reginald had gone entirely silent, his earlier composure in complete and visible ruin, his eyes darting toward the drive as though calculating the odds of escape. And it was this movement that reminded the Duchess, with a jolt, that the confrontation was not yet concluded. "Reginald," the Duke said, not releasing his wife but turning enough to face his brother directly, his voice gone cold and final. "You will remain precisely where you stand until the magistrate arrives at first light. I have a dying shipwright's confession, a letter in my own hand describing your intentions before ever the Meridian sailed, and now a witnessed admission of guilt spoken not 30 seconds past, in front of half the household staff currently fighting the very fire you no doubt arranged to destroy the ledgers proving your embezzlement these past 5 months. I would advise against attempting to run. I have grown, in my time away, considerably less patient with you than I once was." Reginald did not run. He stood very still in the dying firelight, a broken man watching the last of his careful schemes burn to ash alongside the library he had set alight to hide them, and said nothing at all, because there was, by that point, nothing left for him to say. The Duchess, still held close against her husband's chest, felt the first tears she had shed since the funeral finally, properly break free, relief and fury and love, and 11 weeks of a wedding ring worn as a widow's memento all crashing over her at once, while behind her the east wing of Ashcombe Hall burned itself slowly, finally into cinders, and somewhere beyond the smoke, the first gray light of dawn began, very gently, to break. It should have ended there on the terrace, with the fire dying and the truth finally spoken. The Duchess would think, for the rest of her life, that it very nearly did end there, that she had allowed herself, in the exhausted rush of relief that followed her husband's revelation, to believe the worst of the danger had already passed simply because the worst of the secrets finally had. She had not accounted for what a cornered man, staring directly at the ruin of everything he had spent 5 years quietly building toward, might yet be desperate enough to attempt. It happened in the space of a single unguarded breath. While the Duke was occupied giving orders to the groundskeeper, Reginald moved, not toward the drive, as his darting eyes had suggested he might, but toward the Duchess herself, one arm closing hard around her shoulders while the other produced, from some hidden pocket of his greatcoat, a small dueling pistol she had not known he carried. "Nobody move," Reginald said, his voice gone high and strange, all his careful composure finally stripped away. "Nobody move, or I swear before God I will." The Duke turned at the sound of his brother's voice, and the Duchess would remember, for the rest of her life, the particular color his face went in that instant, not fear for himself, but a terror so absolute it seemed to age him a full decade in the space of a single heartbeat. "Reginald," his voice had gone very low, very careful, "put down the pistol. Whatever else is true between us, you are not a murderer of women. I know you are not that." "You know nothing," Reginald said, his arm tightening around the Duchess until she gasped, the cold metal pressing hard against her ribs through the thin fabric of her nightgown. "You know nothing of what these 5 years have cost me, watching you inherit everything simply for the accident of being born 11 months before me, while I managed every ledger and every tenant dispute of an estate that would never, not for one single day, actually belong to me. I did not want you dead, brother. I wanted, only once, to be permitted to matter as much as you did without effort. Was that so very much to ask?" "You could have asked me," the Duke said, something in his voice cracking with a grief the Duchess had not expected to hear directed at the very man who had tried to have him murdered. "I would have given you anything within my power. I never once knew you wanted for anything, because you never once told me you did." "Would you?" Reginald's voice had gone bitter, brittle. "Or would you have smiled and patted my shoulder and told me to be patient, the way you always did. While the two of you shared jokes I was never quite permitted to join." "I would have listened," the Duke said. "I am listening now." For one long, suspended moment, the Duchess felt the pistol's pressure against her ribs waver, felt, in the trembling of Reginald's arm, the presence of a man genuinely uncertain whether he could go through with whatever violence he had, in his panic, threatened. She held very still, and did the only thing she could think to do. She spoke very quietly, not to her husband, but directly to the man holding her. "Reginald," she said, keeping her voice as steady and gentle as 5 months of careful performance had taught her to make it. "I have watched you for 5 months believing me a foolish, grieving widow, too mad to notice anything happening around her. I noticed everything, Reginald. I have copies of the altered ledgers, the overcharged tenants, Duffy's confession, my husband's own letter, hidden in a place your searches never found, and delivered by courier to my solicitor in London a full week past, with instructions to be opened publicly should any harm come to either myself or my husband. Shooting me changes nothing now, except the number of charges you will face when this is finished. Please, put down the pistol. Let this end here tonight, with only a house burned rather than a life lost as well." It was, in truth, only half true. She had sent copies to her solicitor only that very week, prompted by a fear she had not fully examined until this precise, terrifying moment. But she watched the words land regardless, watched something in Reginald's face collapse entirely. The pistol lowered slowly, shaking badly in his hand. "It was never meant to go this far," he said, very quietly, to no one in particular. "I only meant to delay the ship a season. I never meant for the storm. I never meant for any of it to actually—" He did not finish the sentence. The Duke moved then, fast and precise, wresting the pistol from his brother's slackened grip and tossing it well beyond reach into the wet grass before pulling his wife firmly, protectively, behind his own body. Reginald did not resist as the groundskeeper and 2 grooms took hold of his arms. He simply stood, slack and defeated, staring at the ground. "Lock him in the wine cellar until the magistrate arrives," the Duke said, his voice steady again now, though the arm still wrapped around his wife trembled very slightly. "Post 2 men at the door. I want no further accidents befalling anyone in this house before justice is properly done." The Duchess, still shaking, felt him press his lips to the crown of her head with a tenderness that undid, in a single gesture, whatever remaining composure she had managed through the whole long ordeal. "I nearly lost you tonight," he said, very low into her hair. "After 5 months of watching from a distance to keep you safe, I very nearly lost you in the space of a single careless breath." "You did not lose me," she said, turning in his arms to look up at him properly. "I have spent 5 months setting a second plate for a man everyone told me was dead. I did not survive that particular grief only to lose you again on the very night you finally came home to me." He kissed her then, properly, at last, 4 months of careful distance and disguised longing finally, entirely abandoned, while behind them the last embers of the east wing smoldered gently into the gray morning light, and somewhere beyond the estate's boundaries, the world that had believed the Duke of Ashcombe dead for the better part of a year began, unknowingly, its final few hours of that particular mistaken belief. The magistrate arrived at Ashcombe Hall a little past noon, summoned by a rider sent at first light, and found waiting for him a scene he would speak of, for years afterward, as the most remarkable morning of his considerable career. He found a duke believed dead for the better part of a year, alive, unharmed, and entirely prepared to present a case against his own brother with the same methodical precision he had once brought to the management of his estate's accounts. He found a dying shipwright's confession, properly sealed and witnessed. He found a letter in the Duke's own hand, hidden 5 months in a coat lining, describing suspicions of sabotage before the Meridian ever left port. He found altered ledgers and falsified tenant accounts, recovered that very morning from a locked strongbox in Reginald's own rooms. And he found, seated quietly beside her husband throughout the whole long telling of it, a duchess whose composure through 5 months of solitary grief and secret evidence gathering he would later describe, in his official report, as conduct of such remarkable presence of mind as I have rarely encountered in a woman of any station. Reginald did not contest the charges in the end. Faced with the accumulated weight of confession, correspondence, and witnessed admission, he confessed to the whole of it: the bribed shipwright, the deliberately unsound repairs, the falsified accounts he had begun altering within weeks of believing himself secure in his brother's death, even the fire meant to destroy the evidence before anyone thought to examine the estate's books too closely. He would stand trial that autumn and be found guilty on every count, and spend the remainder of his life in circumstances considerably less comfortable than the master apartments he had so briefly, so wrongly occupied. News of the Duke of Ashcombe's survival spread through the county with a particular speed. Such extraordinary news always travels. The physician who had signed the false death certificate, it emerged upon proper investigation, had been paid, like the shipwright before him, to identify a body not his own, recovered from the wreckage of a smaller vessel lost that same week, its ring finger fitted, after the fact, with the Duke's own signet ring, stolen from him during the attack that had nearly claimed his actual life. The Duke himself told the fuller story of his missing year only once, and only to his wife, sitting together in the small dining room where she had set 2 plates every evening for 5 long months. He told her of the attack on the road from the harbor, meant to look like common highway robbery gone fatally wrong. He told her of the fisherman who had found him half-drowned among the rocks below the cliffs and nursed him back to health, asking no questions a desperate man did not wish to answer. He told her of the terrible morning he had learned, from a month-old newspaper wrapping a fish purchased at a country market, that his own funeral had already taken place. "I nearly came to you that very day," he admitted, holding her hand across the small table where they now, finally, ate their dinners together properly. "It was only the fisherman who stopped me. He told me that if my brother had already arranged one death convincingly enough to fool a physician and a coroner both, he would not hesitate to arrange a second, particularly not for a wife whose continued survival might one day prove inconvenient to his claim upon the title. I could not risk your life on my own impatience, however desperately I wanted to. So I waited and I watched, and I built the case that would let me come home to stay." "And the stables," she said, not quite able to keep the ghost of a smile from her voice. "You might have chosen a less humble disguise, husband." "A groom sees everything and is seen by no one," he said, his old, familiar humor creeping properly back into his voice. Reginald never once looked twice at the stable staff in 5 months of careful scheming, though I will say, in my own defense, I did not anticipate falling quite so completely in love with my own wife a second time, watching her grieve me with such stubborn, magnificent loyalty that half the household thought her mad for it. "Half the household did think me mad," she said. "I set 2 plates for dinner every single night for 5 months, husband." "You earned," he said, raising her hand to his lips, "a reputation for a loyalty I did not deserve, and will spend the whole of our remaining years together attempting properly to repay." Outside, the workmen had already begun clearing the charred ruins of the east wing, a library restored exactly as it had been, save for one small addition. A hidden compartment behind the new shelving, built at the Duke's own particular request, though he would not, even now, quite explain what he intended to keep in it. "Old habits," was all he would say when she asked, "die rather harder than I expected, my love. Though I promise you from this day forward they shall only ever be the pleasant kind." Many years later, when their eldest daughter was grown and married herself, and their youngest son had begun asking, as children eventually do, about the old family stories whispered by servants who had witnessed them firsthand, the Duchess, no longer young, though no less stubborn, no less fiercely loyal than she had been at 23, told the story properly for the first time to a grandchild perched upon her knee in that same small dining room. "Grandmother," the child asked, watching her set, as she still did on the anniversary of that terrible, wonderful night each year, 2 plates side by side, though the Duke himself sat only a few feet away in his favorite chair by the fire. "Why do you still set 2 plates when grandfather is right here?" The Duchess smiled and glanced across the room at the man who had once been a stable groom named John Hale, and once before that a young husband lost at sea, and who had, through every disguise and every danger, never once stopped being entirely, completely her own. "Because I spent 5 months of my life learning that hope is not the same thing as foolishness, my darling," she said, smoothing the linen beside the second plate with hands grown gentler, though no less steady, with age. "I set that plate every single night because some part of me refused to believe the world's easy answers, however many people called me mad for it. And when your grandfather finally came home to me, I did not stop the habit. I simply stopped setting it for a man who might never arrive, and started setting it instead for a man I knew, every single evening for the rest of my life, absolutely would." The old Duke, listening from his chair by the fire, said nothing at all, but he rose slowly and crossed the room to take his accustomed seat across from her, exactly as he had every evening for more than 30 years since that first terrible, joyful dawn, and reached for her hand across the table with the same quiet certainty he had reached for it every single night in all the years between. She never stopped setting 2 plates. She had simply, at long last, stopped eating alone. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.